All right, everybody, we are live. So, welcome to our live stream. I am your host, Manar Adli, and I'm the founder and director of Mit Press News. I am joined by our senior staff writer, Alan McLeod, and we are joined by a very special guest today, Yves Engler. But before I introduce him, I'm going to just give a quick intro on what we're going to be talking about today. So it's obviously been about 4 months into the Israeli onslaught on Gaza, and the apartheid state shows very little signs of slowing down. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected a Palestinian ceasefire proposal and claimed that total victory will be his in a matter of months. And just a couple of hours ago, Netanyahu announced that the Israeli military will be basically doing a ground invasion of southern Gaza, the so-called safe zone, where currently 1.5 million Palestinians are taking refuge near the Egypt Gaza border in Rafah. So the question is, where are all these people going to go, and are we going to see another major massacre like we've been seeing in the past few months? So Israel's attacks can only be sustained with economic, military, and political help from the outside, most notably the United States, which has notably been condemned. But our neighbor to the north has been equally supportive of the violence. And we have been listening to all of the, political gymnastics that Justin Trudeau has been playing in his support for arming Israel, sending weapons to Israel, while pretending to care about Palestinian lives. So today we are joined by one of our favorite disruptors and agitators of Canada's political scenes, Yves Engler. He is a Montreal-based author. He's an activist who has been at the forefront of exposing Canada's role as an imperialist power. He has been regularly arrested and even jailed for his attempts to disrupt Canada's business as usual politics. Many of his videos disrupting Canadian political events and weapon manufacturer events have gone viral, and we've shared them at Mit Press. So welcome to the show, Yves.
Thanks for having me and all the good work you do.
Thank you so much. So I want to start by playing a clip of Selena Robinson. She's a cabinet minister whose controversial comments on Palestine made waves in Canada this week. So let's play the clip, and then I'll get your reaction to this. One second. We are going to get this up in just a second here.
We have a whole generation, and we know from the data that it's 18 to 34-year-olds that have no idea about the Holocaust. They don't even think it happened. They don't even understand that Israel was offered to the Jews who were displaced. So they have no connection to how it started. They don't understand that it was a crappy piece of land with nothing on it. There were several 100,000 people, but other than that, it didn't produce an economy. It couldn't grow things. It didn't have anything on it, and that it was the folks who were displaced that came, and the people who had been living there for generations, and together they worked hard, and they had their own battles, right? We know the history. We have a whole generation, and we know from the data that it's 18 to 34-year-olds that have no idea about the Holocaust. They don't even think it happened. They don't even understand that Israel was offered to the Jews who were displaced. So they have no connection to how it started. They don't understand that it was a crappy piece of land with nothing on it. There were several 100,000 people, but other than that, it didn't produce an economy. It couldn't grow things. It didn't have anything on it, and that it was the folks who were displaced that came, and the people who had been living there for generations, and together they worked hard, and they had their own battles, right? We know the history. We have a whole generation, and we know from the data that it's 18 to 34-year-olds.
So there you have it. We have quite an interesting statement that was just made by Robinson. So she basically said Palestine was a crappy piece of land with nothing on it until Israel made the desert bloom. quite a racist statement. Yves, could I first get your reaction to Robinson's comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously a very colonialist, racist statement. The same kind of thinking, the terra nullius thinking, is what was used to justify displacing, dispossessing First Nations in Canada. And she's supposed to be part of a government. This, of course, is an NDP minister. The NDP is supposed to be the Social Democratic left-wing party in Canada. And they're supposed to be, seeking out reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada, and that kind of thinking clearly goes counter to that. It's also, I think it's often kind of framed as Israel and Zionism come after the Nazi Holocaust, but if you actually look at the history of it, Zionism comes out of European imperialism, the height of European imperialism in the late 1800s, the scramble for Africa. It comes out of a Christian Zionist background, nationalist thinking. So it's not even, sort of in terms of to date the Zionist movement, it's sort of incorrect that it just begins after the Nazi Holocaust, which is one way to sort of justify Israel after the fact. So that the other part that's important is that this wasn't just sort of like she used some, as her supporters have tried to frame, some clumsy words in a webinar. This is repeated comments from her that are in the same vein, and maybe more importantly, as a minister, using her authority. She was the post-secondary education minister in British Columbia, and she interceded after a college board found that a professor had not violated their rules by supporting Palestinian resistance. Big, huge controversy, and they had reinstated the professor, Dr. Natalie Knight, and the minister, post-secondary education minister, the day after, responded to a tweet from CIJA, the main Israel lobby group in the country, and denounced the professor being allowed back, said that she had met with the university or the college administration on the matter. And then 24 hours later, the professor was fired after a multi-month internal investigation found there was no problem. And there's also some allegations she intervened with the University of British Columbia, a little bit less clear cut what happened exactly, but she met with the professor or the president of the university, and then a few days later, the anthropology department was counseled to take down a statement in support of Palestinians. So this was a minister who was basically out of control with her support for Israel's genocide. And so this comment was just sort of like the icing on the cake, if you like, of just what she's been doing for months. And what's great about this instance is we, being those against genocide, those who believe Palestinians are human beings, and not just the couple 100,000 that were there, in her words, that didn't matter. We forced her out. There was a multi-day. I mean, it was billed, and people in BC had been organizing around her for a while. But after these comments broke, after the Professors Federations called for her to resign because of her intervention in the firing of the university or the college professor, there was a mass grassroots organizing that forced the minister out, and the premier, really, who's taken a very right-wing pro-Israel turn in recent months, he was very reluctant to force her out, but ultimately the pressure became too big, and Robinson was forced to leave cabinet. She's still a member of the party, still MLA, but she's now also announced that she won't be running after the election in the spring, and sorry, I should say in the fall. And so, yeah, this was, I think, in the history of Canada-Palestine, this is the first time that a minister of a provincial or federal government has ever been forced out because of their anti-Palestinian racism, their comments, and also their anti-Palestinian activities.
Well, it's really interesting because what she said about Israel, allowing the desert to bloom, really echoes the sentiment of NATO countries that have supported Israel in their kind of like white colonialist ideology you know, in kind of painting that there was nobody there, right? I mean, Ursula von der Leyen famously said that last year before Israel invaded Gaza. And it was very, very much racist. I mean, as a Palestinian myself, we see these kinds of comments as just really disgusting and disturbing because it erases Palestinians' identity and their ties to the land. um, so, Alan, I mean, I would like to get your comments um, based on what she was saying or not what she was saying, but based about 18 to 34-year-olds there. Why do older and younger people understand the conflict of Israel and Palestine so differently?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just a comment on Selena Robinson, what she said. I echo what you said about this being a sort of racist trope about there was nobody in this land and then the Israelis made the desert bloom. It's completely ahistorical and racist. We know, because this is one of the most studied pieces of land in world history, that this has an extremely long history going back thousands of years. This is literally the cradle of civilization we're talking about. The strip of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea has been fought over by various civilizations for thousands of years and has had a very, very rich and dense and advanced civilization there for thousands of years, as we've said. But even if that wasn't the case, and it was really just a crappy piece of land in the middle of a desert, that still wouldn't give the Europeans and the Americans the right to just give away this land to this new group of settler colonials coming in. Nevertheless, what I thought was interesting about what Robinson said was that she's so concerned about how young people between 18 and 34 see this conflict so differently. And yeah, it is really extraordinary how different groups of people see what is going on in Gaza with a completely different lens, where we're seeing people in the global north versus the global south who overwhelmingly have supported Palestine, but also in the West we're seeing huge differences in how people understand the conflict based on their age. And I think that's got a lot to do with the sort of media we are consuming. People who are in their 50s, 60s, and older are still, for the most part, relying on old establishment media like cable news, like newspapers, like radio, and they are very, very tightly controlled. They're owned by billionaire oligarchs, or they have ties to the state or are state funded. And those groups of people have a very clear idea about what they want to see in the Middle East. And they certainly don't want to see any anti-imperial or anti-colonial struggles gain traction and ignite a sort of broader anti-colonial struggle going on. So we're seeing wall-to-wall coverage of we call it the Israel-Palestine conflict, but we really should be calling it Israel's war on Gaza or Israel's onslaught on Gaza. We're seeing wall-to-wall support for Israel. The Palestinian view is very rarely even talked about in mainstream media. CNN, for example, the CEO of CNN told all staff that the Hamas position should never be reported by CNN because it's not newsworthy in his opinion. He sent that out to pretty much every CNN employee, and CNN has to send all of their articles and their coverage before it's published to their notoriously pro-Israel Jerusalem bureau, so it's vetted even further. And so that's really the picture that older people are getting of what's going on in the Middle East. But young people, we are not really using those old media. We're not really using that establishment forms of communication. We're really getting our news from social media. And there, despite all of its problems, and me and you, Manar, have talked about the problems with social media so often on the Mintcast and at Mint Press News, but at least there is some sort of semblance of democratic opinion on there. You can actually hear a wide range of opinions, even if you don't want to. And young people are just being bombarded day after day of pictures of the most heinous war crimes that Israel is committing just day after day, hour after hour into our inboxes, whether we want to or not. And that is really changing the way in which we understand this conflict, this war, this onslaught, this genocide. And so there is a huge chasm when you look at the opinion polls in Canada and in the West more generally as to what people think about this. Generally, young people are rejecting Israel en masse. This is a huge problem for Tel Aviv going forward, because if they lose the next generation, they may not be able to keep carrying out this process of colonization and of forcing Palestinians from their homes so Israel can expand. If this doesn't change, then there's going to be serious problems. And that is why Selena Robinson was so wary and so insistent on bringing up young people and how they understand this conflict here. Actually, I was wondering on this topic, Yves, following public pressure, as you said, Robinson's actually resigned from her post. But really, the outcome of this is an exception to the rule, right? Because what Robinson was saying, it might have been obtuse and not the best sort of language, but that's basically the Canadian position, right? That's the official government position and has been for many decades.
Well, certainly a erasure of Palestinians, and certainly in the current context, enabling genocide. A couple of things I just want to mention about this, though, that kind of interesting. One element, for instance, in the terms of the media, okay, CBC, which is the Canadian equivalent to the BBC in the UK, main state kind of broadcaster, significant media outlet. Their coverage of this, one of the headlines people pointed out was the referring to Robinson's comments and why they're controversial. The wording was something to the effect of, the land that Israel, her controversial comment on the land that Israel was created on. They can't use the word Palestine. And CBC, this goes back multiple years now, has an official directive that they don't use the word Palestine unless someone else has used it. So it can appear on air. And this became a controversy when they interviewed a CBC radio program interviewed Joe Sacco, who's the author of a graphic novel titled Palestine. And the reviewer used the word Palestine, and then the next day literally came on air and apologized for having used the word Palestine. So just a little sense of like the intensity of the kind of media, the dominant media kind of erasure and enabling of genocide. Another part about when Robinson made her comment. Her comment was in response to a question about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, which basically the Israel lobby uses as a stick to deflect criticism of Israel. And so she was basically talking about how she was pressuring universities and colleges to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Palestinian definition of anti-Semitism as a way to basically blunt what this rise of consciousness in favor of the Palestinian perspective among the younger generation. At the federal level, the government has, for instance, if they've adopted the IHRA definition, they've set up a special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, all kind of designed to strengthen the hand of the Israel lobby in terms of marginalizing Palestinian solidarity. And that's just one piece of a broad policy in favor of Zionism, in favor of the ongoing genocide that the Trudeau government, the Liberal government, not the more right-wing party, the Conservatives, but the sort of the equivalent of the Democrats in Canada. The Trudeau government has, and Canada, I should say, go back historically. Canada probably maybe what they're doing now is the worst thing they've ever done in supporting Palestinian dispossession. But before the last 4 months, the worst thing Canada ever did was to enable the partition plan in 1947, where Canadian diplomats, then liberal government diplomats, played an important role at the UN. The Canadian judge who was considered the lead architect of the partition plan when the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine went to the region in 1947, they pushed this partition plan, which gave the Zionist movement 55% of historic Palestine, even though the Jewish population was less than a third, owned 7% of the land, and of course was rejected by the indigenous population. So Canada has a long history of enabling Zionism, Palestinian dispossession. And in recent weeks or months, the most egregious examples and elements are Canada's direct ties to the military machine slaughtering Palestinians. So, Canada sells weapons to Israel, both directly and through our major shipments to the U.S. and Canadian arms companies are completely integrated with U.S. Military industry, and this goes back 60 years. It's through a special initiative between Canada and the U.S. Canada, there's Canadians fighting in Gaza. The current government has refused efforts to investigate Canadians and those who've been recruiting in Canada for the Israeli military. You have registered Canadian charities that raise millions and millions of dollars, tens of millions every year, that support projects that assist the Israeli military, and that contravenes current Canada Revenue Agency rules around registered charities, which are granted the ability to provide tax deductions, so they're state subsidized. So that's supporting the Israeli military. And then you have, in recent weeks, the thing that's most kind of off the charts is the Canadian government reaction to the International Court of Justice ruling finding a plausible genocide, and basically pushing Israel to stop their genocide. Not quite that directly, but essentially that's what the ruling was. And the Canadian government's response to that was to not even say a sort of pro forma statement that Israel, was compelled under international law to follow the ruling of the ICJ. But then the same day, cut their funding, the second country to cut the funding to the UN Refugee Agency, just at a time when the International Court of Justice has said that Israel has to let in aid to those being destroyed in Gaza. So Canada's contribution to emboldening, strengthening Israel, it's significant, it's long-standing, it's no matter what the government is, there are small little breaks, and I think that this forcing Robinson to forcing her out of the cabinet is a sign that Palestine Solidarity Movement actually has some power now in official politics, and it kind of puts on warning particularly the NDP, the Social Democratic Party, that things have changed. The party, the overwhelming majority of the base of the party, and even now much of the elected officials, they are not on board with this crass anti-Palestinian outlook.
Okay, guys, I have to change my internet connection.
Well, I think Manar has frozen there, so I'm going to ask you.
I'm back.
Oh, are you all right?
Yes, I was not connected to the right internet. So you guys can hear me and see me okay?
Yes, that's fine, yeah.
Okay, awesome. So sorry about that. So Yves, one of the things that we really admire about you is that you're just like this incredible agitator of the political scene in Canada, and it's really inspiring to see. And so I have a video that I want to play of you disrupting an event, and I would love to get your comment on the context of this. So just one moment, please. And where did it go? There it is. So this one is, I believe, from your Instagram page. So we're going to play this one.
Repeatedly disparaged Palestine solidarity protesters. You've said you support Israel. Do you want to apologize to Palestinians for supporting a genocide in Gaza?
Yves, this is your repeated shtick that you keep doing, and when what you're saying actually isn't correct. So this is an announcement for community housing, and it's very important for the people here. We can address this at any occasion that you want, but your shtick is a tired one. You keep doing it, and it's pretty offensive to people. Thanks.
So you won't answer the question.
I'm not going to answer your questions from you.
You won't answer a question from me because I ask you questions.
No, because what you ask me is ridiculous, and you get in people's faces, and you do it every minister. Everyone knows.
I believe we waited to the whole press conference. But I'm going to ask you. So I'll ask a follow up, Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller, you're a minister in a government. You're a minister in a government. Okay, right? People, you have press conferences. People can ask you questions. That's part of the deal. So I'll ask you an easier question then.
Yeah,
Do you agree with Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, UN Special Rapporteur, that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid?
There is a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza that us, Canada, as a country, is trying to address as a country that is trying to end the death, and that's what we're focused on, Yves. You've been doing this to make a political point way before this conflict arose. I know this is personal to you, but for God's sake, you get in people's faces, you get in ministers' faces, you jumped in Minister Champagne's car. Do you think that's good behavior?
We're talking about 20,000. You're responding to saying a journalist. You're saying a journalist going up and asking ministers questions. 20,000 people. 20,000. I've dozen published books, for God's sakes. I've written hundreds of articles. 20,000 people killed. More than 20,000 people killed. And your response is it's about me. 20,000 people killed. Your government is enabling genocide in Gaza, and you're going to make it about me.
You make it about me.
Hi, Mr. Miller.
Wow. I mean, talk about deflection there. I mean, that was probably one of my favorite interactions that you've had because of the way that they reacted. I mean, he reacted in a way to dismiss all of this death, this genocide, to say, hey, you're not acting very nice. That's bad behavior. Well, what about what Israel is doing? 1,000 people in Gaza, that's not good behavior? Like, what is that? Talk to me about this event, who this person is, and what happened here.
Yeah, he's the immigration minister now. He was the indigenous minister before that, and I had previously asked him a question, kind of linking that, the Israel's dispossession of Palestinians to his framing of Canadian colonialism, which he obviously also didn't like, and he tried to walk away from, but he was kind of forced by the situation to kind of sort of answer it in a very dubious way. I mean, I was taken aback, of course, from that response. Like he's spent more time thinking about me than he I think has about what Canada's enabling in terms of genocide in Gaza. That I think is troubling. From I think anybody, any Canadian should think that's troubling versus paying attention to important international news. But in this case, I mean, the point of doing these things is to ask questions. The underlying a lot of this is that the journalists who have access to the politicians, the journalists who are invited, who are supposed to be at these press conferences, they don't ask the questions that should be asked.
Yeah.
And so that's one element to this. Another.
Yeah, and can I just interrupt and say that was actually a government minister you were speaking to, Mark Miller, right?
Yes, yeah, it was Mark Miller. Yeah, government minister Mark Miller, immigration minister. So the whole game with how the journalists work and the politicians is it's a pretty chummy club, right? And they sort of all know there are questions that should be asked or shouldn't be asked. And overwhelmingly, they sort of stick to the script, and Canada enabling genocide is not part of the script. And I should say it's not just about Palestine, and Miller kind of alludes to that. which is that it's on foreign policy particularly. It's particularly all of Canadian foreign policy is pro-empire, is pro-corporation, is very anti-human, and it gets almost no critical attention in the dominant media. So we've been doing these types of things for multiple years. We actually, before the pandemic, we had a group set up called the Disruption Network Canada, where we shared information across the country of where different politicians, mostly ministers, would be speaking, holding press conferences, and we would try to get people there, either to just ask a critical question, maybe to hold up a sign, maybe to sort of disrupt in a kind of more aggressive way, more just heckle, I guess would be the proper term. And then over the past couple years, since the pandemic, we kind of restarted some of that activism. And what I found is that oftentimes, while at one point it was a bit more oriented around kind of disruption, I found that often asking the questions is kind of like the best way, because they often really just can't answer and just will refuse to answer. And sometimes they do it in ways that just really expose themselves. And I had that opportunity with the sports minister maybe 8 months ago or so, where I got her at this completely unrelated event, just sort of going and seeing some technology, and she I asked her if that she called for Russian and Belarusian athletes to be blocked from Olympics and international sporting events, and I said, well, how about U.S. athletes after the invasion of Iraq? Would you think they should also be excluded? And then I went into Canadian athletes and Israeli athletes, but her look, she gave me this like smirk where she just like, this was the craziest question in the world, even though it was a totally, I think most people would consider a totally reasonable question. Well, why Russian athletes and not U.S. athletes? And then she literally like ran for the elevator, and so you sort of you can just sort of expose their inability to deal with the double standards and the I guess contradictions through just sort of showing up and asking difficult questions. Now, when it comes to kind of a more disruptive angle to it, the logic in terms of going to a press conference and being kind of disruptive is that the ministers have the ability, the politicians have the ability and the resources to bring in the media, right? The media will show up. If we organize a press conference, no one will show up. But the ministers have the ability to bring the media to a place. And so activists can go there and make a statement and often get some of or most of the media attention from just going there. And it's, sort of fairly low energy, it doesn't take that much resources to do that. Unfortunately, and that succeeded on some issues. Like, I disrupted the environmental minister about calling him a climate criminal, and then that led to like almost all the media that was there covering the message. But what I found on Palestine is that the media bias is so stark that even if you go and you like disrupt a minister at a press conference and like they just won't cover it still, right? Even if they're there, even if they get good video footage of it, they just won't even cover it. The bias is so stark. So of course the element is more kind of like social media and taking a video of what's being done to then circulate it on social media. And in some cases it's been very successful where social media, you get millions of people watch these clips, and I think it helps in terms of, I don't know that it people learn that much from it, but what I think it does do is it emboldens resistance, right? It strengthens our collective sense that this is just outrageous and we should be doing something, acting, but be that demonstration, be that sign a petition, be that blockade a arms company, whatever it is. These sort of people seeing this on social media, I think, kind of strengthens their resolve to take action, which of course is very important.
Well, and what you just described is very similar to what we have in the US. Our politicians are gated in Washington D.C. and it's so seldom that reporters outside of the mainstream get access to these politicians and have the opportunity to speak directly with them. But Code Pink has been, able to get into the Senate and into Congress and to agitate, I guess you could say, and confront these politicians on their support for Israel. And their responses are very similar to what you just experienced. I mean, they make it about the activists, and like, that's not polite to come to our office and put these signs up. They talk about politeness, and they talk about the proper way to handle these situations, just the same way that that person did with you. And they don't actually address the fact that Israel is committing genocide, or they just turn the whole narrative around to make it about Hamas. The same thing that we see over and over again. But we commend you for having that courage. It does embolden people to take action, and it also shows the hypocrisy of these politicians that, especially leftist politicians or politicians who purport to represent, human rights and democracy, who can say the most lovely things to their followers and constituents, but in reality, they are just a bunch of fascists, right? They're still supporting genocide. They're still supporting the military-industrial complex. So Canada is also part of a Western coalition now bombing Yemen. So, I mean, that's interesting to see after Ansar Allah announced a blockade of Israeli ships aiding Israel from entering the Red Sea. What do you make of Ansar Allah actions and the Western response to Ansar Allah?
Well, I support the bid to end the genocide, and they've stepped up and taken. There's a good argument to be made that they're the group that's done most to, maybe alongside South Africa, that's to enforce the Genocide Convention of 1948. Right, the Canadian government is all about responsibility to protect. Previous governments, Canada's foreground in pushing this notion, and they used it to overthrow a government in Haiti in 2004. Bomb Libya and stuff like that. But you see the Houthis actually doing something to try to stop the genocide. Now, that's of course completely outside of bounds for the masters in Washington. And they are the ones who are going to shape. This is a threat to U.S. dominance. And so they're going to respond as they do, which is by killing people and bombing, and the Canadian government has gone along with that. They've gone along with it in it's fairly minimal. I think it's a Protective Guardian, I think is the name of the mission. Canada's officially only sent 3 soldiers who are planners with that. There's no officially. There's the other military assets that have been deployed, but in reality, there's a couple parts. One is that Canada is completely integrated. The Canadian military is completely integrated with the U.S. military, and through like NORAD, which is supposed to be about North American defense of. In practice, Canadians are part of NORAD, that they are involved in spying and other activities all around the world. And so Canadians, part of NORAD, would be almost certainly assisting the U.S. In their Middle East policy now. But beyond that, there's a Canadian base in Kuwait, which has been the base for the Canadians who've been in Iraq. There's fewer Canadians in Iraq now, but there's still multiple hundreds of Canadian troops in the region. There's also Canadian naval vessels have been patrolling the region basically constantly since 2002. which they assisted, even though Canada officially wasn't part of the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. Canadian naval vessels actually led the blockade of Iraq, and the Canadian government had legal opinions saying it was legally at war with Iraq for what it had done on that front. So the Canadian military is likely assisting in other ways the U.S. UK bombings, but on top of that, the Canadian government is providing diplomatic support. So they've put out multiple statements, basically saying Canada is one of 5 countries that's supporting the U.S. bombings in Yemen. So we prefer to, rather than put pressure on Israel, or maybe even better way to frame it is rather than withdraw extensive support we're giving to Israel as they genocide Gaza. Instead, we target those who are trying to end the Israeli onslaught, which is just one more way in which Canada's complicit.
And Alan, I want to turn this question over to you because you just recently released an investigation on MIT Press about media coverage of Yemen and basically how major media outlets, and I'm going to share this screen here, you conducted a study of dozens of articles showing that your study found that media giants from the New York Times, where is it? Here it is. New York Times, CNN, and Fox News are pushing for U.S. war in Yemen, and they're doing this through the language in which they describe Yemen's reaction to Yemen's blockade in the Red Sea. Could you tell us a little bit about what you found with this coverage? I'm going to share the screen.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
No problem. Yeah, I guess after a decade of steadfastly ignoring Yemen, even though it was the world's worst humanitarian crisis, suddenly the 4 outlets that I studied, the New York Times, CNN, Fox News, and NBC News, are very interested in Yemen and what's going on there. Now, Ansar Allah, which is usually called the Houthis in the Western press, in fact, the words Ansar Allah in the 60 different articles I studied only appeared twice, and that was in their own words. It wasn't the press's words, it was the Yemeni government using that term. They present their actions as a humanitarian blockade, essentially, as Yves was saying, trying to really use the language of the responsibility to protect doctrine, which the United Nations, read United States, really pushed into international politics in the 1990s and 2000s. However, that's not how it was presented at all in the West. It was not presented as a humanitarian blockade. Generally, if there were any reasons provided at all, it was things like supporting Hamas because they were on the same team as Iran or Hezbollah or Hamas, and the plight of the Palestinians wasn't mentioned so much. Also, media tended to denigrate Ansar Allah as a terrorist group rather than the de facto government of Yemen. They've been in control there for many years. The Ansar Allah control the vast majority of the land which the Yemeni people live on. There is still a Saudi-backed government that controls a small amount of the population, but honestly, without Saudi support, it would probably fall pretty quickly. Another thing I found in the 60 articles was a propensity to just constantly, even though we're talking about Yemen, constantly point the finger at Iran. Literally hundreds of times throughout the articles, the journalists who wrote these things constantly reminded readers that the Houthis, or Ansar Allah as we really should be calling them, are Iran-backed. In fact, you'd be forgiven for thinking that their real name is the Iran-backed Houthis, because it came up time and time again, sometimes 6, 7, 8 different times in a single article. And the obvious implication of that is that Iran is really the puppet master pulling the strings in the Middle East. And again, if you take that one step further, calls for striking back at Iran, regime change Iran, or even war with Iran are now very much prevalent in our political discourse and in our media discourse as well. And so what we're seeing here is establishment media again beating the drums for war. They're not telling their readers why Ansarullah is doing this. Instead, they are recommending that the United States strike back, that they take strikes against Yemen, perhaps even against Iran. And these things really risk escalating what's already happening in the Middle East to a World War III-like scenario. But again, throughout these articles, the United States is never presented as the aggressor. They're always presented as responding to actions from others. And if there's any talk about a wider war, it's always been presented as the United States as this bumbling, neutral actor who's just getting, quote unquote, sucked in or pulled into conflicts against their will, rather than the reality, which is the United States is very much not neutral in the Middle East and is actually constantly driving wars over the last few decades, as we've seen in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, and all over the region, frankly. And so we have a situation where when you actually read imperial media from outlets like the ones I studied, New York Times, Fox, etc., it really bears such a stark resemblance to the press releases coming out of Joe Biden's White House that I think we should just skip the middleman and just start listening to the White House themselves, because frankly, you're not getting very much out of these outlets except more imperial propaganda.
Absolutely. We don't have a corporate media anymore. We have an extremist media beating the drums of war. And that's something that I often that I often say when describing corporate media. And it's the same thing in Canada. Yves, you disrupted, let's see here. You've also attempted to disrupt the Canadian media and its reporting of the situation in Gaza. I mean, you've laid it out very clearly that there's a major bias when it comes to coverage of Palestine, and Canadian media is no different than American media or British media in that it very much sides with Israel and paints Israel as a victim, as this beacon of democracy and human rights surrounded by hostile neighbors, and that it has a right to defend itself. So I'm going to play this video right now of you accosting CBC host David, don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, David Corain. Excuse me.
My name's Yves Engler.
Okay, are you recording?
I am recording.
Okay.
So why does the CBC not refer to it as a genocide that Israel's committing?
I'm working. I'm not. Thanks.
But it's always kid gloves, right? It was always kid gloves. The language you use is like the massacre that Hamas committed on October 7th, but you never say the massacre, the slaughter that Israel's committing on a daily basis. Why is that? You're all about power and politics. You're all about asking,
Look, we're covering the story as best we can and as fairly as we can, and that's all I can promise you. So, I don't appreciate this, and it's a free country. You can do what you're doing.
You don't appreciate being asked questions?
But no, you're allowed to do what you're doing.
Your reporter doesn't appreciate asking questions?
No. I mean,
but why the double standard? Why did the double standard? You have a strong language of what Hamas did, but not about the genocide. We're over 25,000 killed. That's your response? Just walk away? So why do...
I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was having a cough attack, so I just had to mute myself. But in that clip, that we just watched, you suggested that CBC, the Canadian state media broadcaster, has put forward a biased and one-sided interpretation of the violence. Is Canadian media similar to U.S. media in that regard? I mean, I kind of suggested that earlier. And do you believe that Canadians are just as propagandized as Americans? Because clearly he's not used to receiving those kinds of questions that you laid forth for him.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is yes. How the propaganda works is slightly different, but it's if you investigate Canadian foreign policy and how Canada is portrayed, even where there's a bit more space in the Canadian and dominant Canadian media to criticize the U.S. than there is in U.S. media. But there's not more space than to criticize Canada's role globally, right? So they're sort of at the more like left liberal end of the dominant media. They'll sort of say, yeah, the U.S. can act as a hegemon, but they won't really say that Canada is part of that. In this case, this is the Power and Politics, which is a prominent on the CBC News World program, and this would be somebody who would consider himself a serious journalist, right? This is not just he would consider himself liberal-minded for sure, and he would claim to this would be, I guess, maybe somebody equivalent to like an MSNBC Rachel whatever
Rachel Maddow.
yeah, kind of in that vein. But he's also just like, as you point out, he's not used to being challenged at all. And one of the things that was very interesting, where I bumped into him was at the mall that's connected to the hotel, the Queen Elizabeth Hotel, big hotel in Montreal, where the Liberal Party, the Liberal cabinet, so all the cabinet ministers were meeting. And if you see, he basically, when I start asking him, he walks towards the hotel and then goes behind the police line. And to me, it really symbolized, this was like turned into a real fortress. This was about, I guess, 3 weeks, a month ago. And the hotel was just really shut down. A bunch of the entrances and exits, it's tied into the train station. You couldn't get there via the train station. You had to go through only 2 entrances. But the official journalists were part of the in crowd, right? He had the badge that allowed him to keep walking into the hotel. I did not have that badge, and it I think symbolized to me the kind of like those close ties between the establishment journalists and the government in office. So it was. I was obviously happy to just sort of by chance bump into him, and it's also, as I mentioned, with the CBC, right? The CBC is the place where the sort of like leftward, the right wing, the Fox News kind of media of Canada will say we have to defund the CBC. Because this is this hub of left wing whatever, but in reality it's absolutely not, right? There's been investigation. I mentioned the Palestine stuff, but the Amnesty and the Human Rights Watch reports that said that Israel's committing the crime of apartheid a couple of years ago. There was one look at the CBC's coverage of that, and I believe it was like one time they mentioned that question. Then over the past 4 months. It wasn't until like about 3 weeks, a month ago, just before South Africa's case, that CBC even did one story that sort of looked at what many people were saying, which is that there was a genocide taking place. That they actually sort of investigated that question, and even when they did that, they did it in a very kind of careful kind of way. So even though it's framed as this sort of like left wing, in some cases pro-Palestinian, whatever. In reality, it very much toes the Canadian government line, Israeli government line.
So we don't have a lot of time. We actually have many more questions to ask you, but we don't have a lot of time left. But I do want to play one of my favorite disruptions that you made at comedian TV host Chelsea Handler when she came to Canada, because she's always been kind of presented in America as like this feminist, liberal, etc. But obviously she's a huge staunch ally and supporter of Israel. So let me just present that really quick.
16,000 Palestinians killed. You're supporting genocide. Why won't you condemn Israel's killing of Palestinians? Why won't you condemn it? 8,000 children have been killed. You support the IDF. You support the Israeli military. Support Israel's killing of Palestinians.
All right. So yeah, I mean, talk to me about Chelsea Handler's supporting of the IDF.
Yeah, well,
What has she done?
I have to be honest with you. I didn't even know who she was until
She's pretty big here. Yeah, she's pretty big in the U.S.
And so someone, I think she's actually fairly big here too, but I until someone reached out saying that their friend who thought of her as a sort of liberal-minded kind of person, I guess was a fan of hers, and that then became aware in recent months that she signed a statement. I think a week or so, I can't remember all the details now, but a week or so after October 7th. And then she made these jokes and whatever, but attacked the left who were, opposing the slaughter in Gaza and saying, oh, they're Hamas against LGBTQ rights and this and that. And so she had actually bought the ticket. I didn't buy the ticket. She had bought the ticket, and so her friend knew that I had done these types of things in the past, and gave me the ticket. Unfortunately, the ticket was at the back of the thing, so I had to yell really loud. It was a little bit difficult. You can't see it that well on the video I did because it's so far away, but she does stop. And she does make a quip. She makes a quip, which I'm not 100% sure because the security was taking me out. I think she said something to the effect that I was with Hamas. I supported Hamas.
What just a great way to end that conversation.
Yeah, and so, but I think subsequently I saw something she made. She kind of like referenced it in something. But yeah, so there's.
And by the way, she is I believe, and Alan, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe she's a contributor to The Daily Show now with Trevor Noah. She has
I'm not sure why you think I'd know if that's correct, but it sounds about right.
Which is a big deal. I mean, this person who is extremely racist and vocally supportive of the IDF is on one of the most watched, comedy shows in the United States. Of course, we know that The Daily Show is not necessarily real comedy. It's always been in line with like the Democratic Party and the Liberal parties, with a little bit of critiques here and there, but like mostly they're pretty aligned with them. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Yves.
No, yeah. No, I don't have much more. I researched her a bit after I was given, but I don't know much more about.
Okay. Well, I just have one final question for you. And that is about a lawsuit. Let me go back to my questions over here. So recently, there's been a number of groups, including Canadian Lawyers for Human Rights, that have announced a lawsuit against the Trudeau administration, attempting to stop them from selling more weapons to Israel, which they argue violates both domestic and international law. What have you made of this lawsuit? And do you think there's a chance it may succeed in its goals of increasing the accountability of the current government? And if you could just kind of wrap up talking to us about just Justin Trudeau and his kind of, the gymnastics that he uses in his speeches, where he, talks about supporting Israel, but also talks about, supporting Palestinian human rights while aiding Israel in its genocide.
Yeah, they served notice. They gave the government 14 days. It's ALHAC and the Canadian Association of Lawyers Human Rights, I believe, which is I'm not particularly familiar with the organization, but it's been around for more than 3 decades. And they are basically, I mean, their demands, I think there's 5 demands in there, but they essentially resolve around the idea that Canada has to stop selling weapons to Israel. And what they're basically saying is that it's violating Canadian law, current Canadian law in the Export Act. And I think that they're not the first group that's raise that, I think that's pretty solid. It's also violating Canada's responsibilities under the International Arms Trade Treaty. So I think both of the legal case is strong at that level. I don't know enough about the law to know how that plays out. How the courts will do this. The courts are very deferential to the government and government authority. Also, Nicaragua just announced that they're taking 4 countries: Canada, I think Germany, UK, and Netherlands, to the International Court of Justice over their role in enabling Israel's genocide. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know enough to know how solid all this is. I know there's another case being, a couple of other cases. One that began around Canada taking Canada to the International Criminal Court over its role in enabling Israel's violence. So I don't know where this will go. I mean, politically, I think it's very important. Even if there's small chance that the legal cases can succeed, that it's a way of building political pressure, and so that's I think very important. The Canadian government, of course, just yesterday, the foreign minister is claiming Canada is not selling weapons to Israel and hasn't done so for 30 years, which is just wild because we have the data. So I'm not exactly sure how they feel they can pull this off, but this isn't actually Canadian representative in Ramallah. A couple of years ago, there was a controversy over that, where she denied. She had a big Twitter spat with Ali Abunimah from Electronic Intifada, claiming that Canada didn't provide any military support to Israel, which also was completely incorrect. So this is a line they're trying to play, and it gets to, I think, kind of the broader question that you're getting at, is that Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government, there's 2 parts. They first of all, their whole marketing, their main marketing for their foreign policy, not just around this issue, but just across the board, is that the international rules-based order, right? This framing that they're support this international rules-based order. They don't talk about international law that much, and there's all a bunch of questions in there, but they kind of frame that. So when them being taken to the ICC or ICJ, that's a big problem. And also we see the complete bankruptcy of their claims to international rules-based order when they don't support South Africa's case. But in fact, in the past, it's even worse. There was an effort to bring Israel to the International Criminal Court back in 2020, Canada basically threatened its funding to the ICC if they investigated Israel. And then 8 months ago, when the General Assembly called for an International Court of Justice ruling around states' responsibilities amidst Israel's ongoing settlement, which are war crimes, the Canadian government sent a statement basically saying that ICJ shouldn't even offer an opinion, that the General Assembly had called for overwhelming resolution. They shouldn't even offer a legal opinion on this matter. So Canada's been, incredibly hostile to international, so-called international rules-based order when it comes to Palestinian rights.
It's the same with the U.S. I mean, from John Bolton to Mike Pompeo. I mean, they've threatened to invade The Hague if the U.S. is taken to the International Criminal Court, and if its allies, including Israel, are investigated for war crimes. So it just goes to show that these countries don't live by the rules of international law. It's all theatrics. So it's sad. It's sad to see, but we're very happy to see people like you, our neighbors to the north, taking action and disrupting the political scene in Canada. And, we need more of that. In the United States, our politicians aren't used to that kind of disruption. And I think they're getting more and more of that with Israel's genocide in Gaza. I mean, people are watching a genocide on their smartphones, and it's really, really hard to ignore. And so this is the time for the mass population around the world to speak up against their governments. And you're doing that. Organizations here like Code Pink are doing that. And now even just regular people who didn't even find themselves to be political in the past are joining in and disrupting and organizing and protesting and occupying their political elected officials' offices, which is really great to see. But we have to remember that if and when a ceasefire is announced, these disruptions can't stop because Israel did commit genocide and they have full intent on continuing that genocide in other ways. And they continue to occupy Palestine. And the United States and countries like Canada are continuing to arm Israel and empower the apartheid state in other ways. And so, perhaps this war could come to an end, but that doesn't mean that the occupation ends or the apartheid system comes to an end. That will continue until we dismantle the whole system. So, Yves, thank you so much for joining us today. It was an honor to have you. We'll be continuing to follow your disruptions and your work and your writings and your podcast. So we really appreciate your work. And just want to remind everybody that our YouTube channel has been demonetized, like so many other independent media outlets. And so we ask that if people support us by becoming a member on our Patreon. So until next week, we will see everybody then. Bye.
Thank you.